Your grandmother saved my life 30 years ago. Now it's my turn. The man with dragon tattoos was carrying my broken body into a penthouse that overlooked the city like a throne room. I didn't know him. I didn't know why he was helping me. And I definitely didn't understand why 3 men had just beaten me half to death in a hospital parking garage. But he knew everything. He knew my name, Adiz Nwosu. He knew my grandmother's name, Neoma. He knew what I'd done 3 hours ago in Trauma Bay 4. And he knew exactly who had just tried to kill me for it. I don't understand, I whispered, each word costing me pain. He laid me down on a leather couch that probably cost more than my yearly salary. His obsidian eyes held secrets that could swallow me whole. You will, he said, and then he made a phone call in Korean that sounded like a declaration of war. But before I tell you what happened next, what this dangerous man did to the people who hurt me, and why my grandmother's mercy 30 years ago just saved my life, you need to hit that subscribe button right now. Because the story gets darker, more dangerous, and more impossible to walk away from. And trust me, you don't want to miss what Yong Hun Kong does when someone threatens what's his. Subscribe and let's get back to the moment everything changed. Let me take you back. Back to when I was just a broke medical resident trying to survive. Back to the moment everything changed. 19 hours of being awake. That's where this story starts. My hands smelled like blood, arterial spray from a gunshot victim with gang tattoos and a severed femoral artery. My scrubs were hidden under my grandmother's old coat, the one that still carried her scent. The one she'd worn when she left Nigeria 40 years ago with nothing but her nursing degree and a promise to heal without judgment. $180,000 in student debt. That's what it cost me to follow in her footsteps. That's what it cost to become Dr. Nwosu instead of just Adiz, the girl from the neighborhood where sirens never stop. I hadn't slept. Couldn't afford to. Not when rent was $1,850 and going up. Not when every dollar went to surviving instead of living. The parking garage was dark. Level 3, Section C. My car was 4 rows away. Just 4 rows. Might as well have been 4 miles. The footsteps behind me weren't accidental. They knew my schedule. They knew my car. They knew I just saved the life of a man who belonged to the Korean syndicate. And they were here to teach me that mercy has consequences. Dr. Nwosu. I turned. 3 men. Eastern European accents. Tattoos that told stories of violence. Eyes that had stopped seeing people as human a long time ago. You made a choice tonight, the leader said, stepping closer. The wrong choice. I'm a doctor, I said, my grandmother's voice steady in my head even as my hands shook. I save lives. All lives. He smiled. Cold. Empty. Noble. But stupid. Then they were on me. The first blow came without warning. A fist to the kidney that dropped me to my knees on the wet asphalt. I tried to turn, tried to see faces, but another impact crashed into my ribs, stealing my breath. The pain was sharp, precise, surgical almost. These weren't drunken thugs looking for a wallet. These were professionals. They worked in silence, their movements coordinated like dancers who'd rehearsed this routine 1,000 times. A boot to my side, a knee to my back. Each strike calculated, measured. They broke ribs, I heard them crack like dry branches, but they avoided anything vital. This wasn't about killing me. This was about sending a message written in bruises and fractured bones. I curled into myself, arms wrapped around my head, tasting copper and rain. The concrete was cold against my cheek, gritty with city dirt. Somewhere above me, one of them spoke for the first time. His voice was flat, emotionless, like he was reading off a grocery list. Tell Yong Hun Kong we can reach anyone. Then nothing. Just the sound of footsteps fading into the night, swallowed by the steady drumbeat of rain on pavement. I lay there, each breath a knife in my chest, watching rainwater pool around me, pink with my own blood. The world tilted sideways, colors bleeding together like a watercolor painting left in the rain. Darkness crept in from the edges of my vision, soft and merciful. I welcomed it. Time became meaningless. Seconds or hours, I couldn't tell. But eventually, I felt it, the rain on my face, colder now. My body screaming at me to move, to get up, to survive. I managed to roll onto my back, staring up at the night sky. No stars. Just clouds and the faint orange glow of streetlights reflecting off the rain. Then I heard it. The low rumble of an engine. Headlights swept across the alley, bright and blinding, turning the raindrops into diamonds falling from heaven. The car stopped. A door opened. Footsteps, different from before, slower, heavier, purposeful. A shadow fell across me, blocking out the light. I tried to focus, but my eyes wouldn't cooperate. Everything was blurred, doubled, wrong. Jesus Christ. The voice was low, rough like gravel tumbling in a cement mixer, but there was something else underneath it. Something smooth and dark like expensive bourbon. Who the hell did this to you? I tried to answer, tried to warn them to run, to get away before those men came back. But my mouth wouldn't form words. Only a wet, rattling sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. Strong hands slid under me, impossibly gentle despite their size. Easy now. I've got you. Just breathe. The world tilted again as they lifted me. Pain exploded through my chest, white hot and all-consuming. I must have made some sound because the voice came again, closer now, speaking directly into my ear. I know it hurts, but you're going to be okay. I promise you that. There was something in that voice, conviction, certainty, command. The kind of voice that didn't make promises it couldn't keep. I wanted to believe it. God, I wanted to believe it so badly. As consciousness slipped away again, I caught one final glimpse of my rescuer in the headlights. A face all hard angles and shadows, eyes that reflected the light like a wolf's. Then darkness took me completely, and I fell into it like a stone dropped into deep water, wondering if I'd ever find my way back to the surface. Adi's eyes fluttered open to a ceiling that seemed to breathe luxury. Smooth white plaster unmarred by cracks or water stains, recessed lighting that glowed soft as moonlight. This wasn't the hospital. The antiseptic smell was absent, replaced by something darker, richer. Sandalwood and cedar, maybe leather. Her body sank into sheets so fine they felt like water against her bruised skin. She tried to sit up and her ribs screamed in protest. The room tilted, then steadied. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across one entire wall, revealing a city sprawled below like scattered diamonds on black velvet. She was high up, very high up, the kind of height that separated gods from mortals. Easy. The voice came from the shadows near the window, smooth as aged whiskey. You took a beating. Your body needs time. Adi's breath caught. A figure stood silhouetted against the night sky, broad shoulders blocking out entire city blocks. As he turned, the ambient light caught his bare torso and she forgot how to breathe. Dragons. Serpentine bodies coiled across his chest and shoulders in intricate detail. Scales that seemed to shimmer with each breath. Claws that raked across his ribs. Eyes that blazed with an artist's precision. The ink was masterwork, the kind that cost more than her yearly rent. But it was the man wearing them that made her pulse stutter. Yong Hun Kong moved like violence wrapped in silk. Each step measured, controlled, as if he'd calculated the exact amount of force needed to cross a room without disturbing the air. His face was all sharp angles, high cheekbones, a jaw that could cut glass, eyes so dark they swallowed light, and cold. God, those eyes were cold. Where am I? Her voice came out rougher than she intended. Somewhere safe. He stopped at the foot of the bed, arms crossed over that decorated chest. They won't touch you again. They? The word tasted bitter. Images flashed. Derek's fist. The smell of his cologne mixed with her own blood. The cold concrete against her back. She flinched and hated herself for it. Your ex-boyfriend and his friends. Yong Hun's voice dropped several degrees below freezing. The ones who thought putting their hands on you was acceptable. She tried to process this. The club. The bathroom. The explosion of violence that had erupted when she tried to leave. Then nothing. Just darkness and the sensation of falling. You were there. I was. He moved to a nearby chair, all fluid grace despite his size. The dragons shifted with him, seemed to prowl across his skin. You walked into the middle of a business transaction. Bad timing on your part. Good timing on mine. Business transaction? Adi's laugh came out broken. Is that what we're calling gang fights now? Something flickered in those dead eyes. Amusement, maybe, or respect. I prefer entrepreneur. With gang tattoos. These? He glanced down at the dragons like he'd forgotten they existed. Cultural heritage. My grandfather was Yakuza. Old school Tokyo. The dragons are a reminder that some legacies can't be scrubbed clean. No matter how many legitimate businesses you buy. The casual way he admitted it made her skin prickle. This man, this beautiful dangerous man, had just confessed to organized crime ties like he was discussing the weather. And she was in his bed, in his penthouse, wearing what felt like a silk nightgown that definitely wasn't hers. Why did you help me? The question that mattered most. Yonghun stood, moved back to the windows. The city lights painted him in shades of amber and shadow. Because I saw what they were doing to you. And because... He paused, jaw tightening. Because my sister once called for help and no one came. The silence that followed felt heavier than marble, sharper than steel. Adiz watched the dragons on his back rise and fall with each breath, and wondered what kind of man saved strangers in the name of ghosts. Kong leaned back in his leather chair. His fingers steepled beneath his chin as he studied Neoma across the polished mahogany desk. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, humming with unspoken history. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of decades. 30 years ago, I was 16 years old and bleeding to death on a clinic doorstep in Enugu. Neoma's breath caught. She watched as something shifted behind his eyes. A vulnerability she hadn't expected from a man who commanded billions with a phone call. It was 3 in the morning. I'd been stabbed twice. Left for dead in an alley after witnessing something I shouldn't have seen. The kind of thing that gets people killed in Lagos's Underworld. He paused, his jaw tightening at the memory. I crawled for 6 blocks, leaving a trail of blood behind me. Every door I knocked on stayed shut. Every face that peered through a window turned away. He rose from his chair and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering Shanghai skyline. But not your grandmother. Dr. Chidinma opened her door without hesitation. Didn't ask my name. Didn't ask what happened. Just pulled me inside and went to work. Neoma felt tears prick her eyes. She'd heard stories of her grandmother's dedication, but never this one. She operated on me right there in her clinic with whatever supplies she had. No questions. No judgment. Just steady hands and a determination that wouldn't let death win. Kang's reflection in the window showed a slight smile. When I woke up 2 days later, she was sitting beside my cot reading a medical journal. She looked up and said, "You're alive. What you do with that gift is between you and God." He turned back to face Neoma, and she saw moisture gathering in the corners of his eyes. She kept me hidden for 3 weeks while I recovered. Fed me, changed my bandages, taught me that mercy wasn't weakness. It was the highest form of strength. When it was safe, she helped me disappear, start over. I had no idea, Neoma whispered. She never told anyone. That was her way. Kong moved back to his desk, pulling out an old photograph from a locked drawer. He slid it across to Neoma. A young, thin boy with frightened eyes sat on a clinic bed beside a woman whose warm smile was unmistakably her grandmother's. I built everything you see around you from nothing. Every business, every success, every dollar in my accounts. But none of it would exist without those 3 weeks in that cramped clinic in Enugu. His voice grew fierce. Your grandmother gave me my life when no one else would. I'm returning the favor. Neoma stared at the photograph, her fingers trembling as they traced her grandmother's face. She never mentioned you. Not once. Because she didn't save me for recognition or reward. She saved me because it was right. Kang's expression hardened with resolve. But I never forgot. I spent years searching for a way to repay her. When I learned she'd passed, I thought that chance was gone forever. Then your father's situation came across my desk, and I saw your name. He pulled out another folder, this one thick with documents. This isn't charity, Neoma. This isn't pity. This is a debt 30 years overdue. Your grandmother didn't just save my life that night. She taught me that one person's courage can change everything. She showed me what it means to risk everything for someone else's tomorrow. Kang met her eyes with an intensity that made her heart pound. So when I say I'm going to save your father, when I say I'm going to give you everything you need to succeed, understand this is blood debt. Sacred. Unbreakable. Your grandmother bled for me in that clinic. Now I bleed for you. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, nestled between a grocery store flyer and a credit card offer. Adiz almost threw it away with the junk mail until she noticed the law firm's embossed letterhead. Her hands trembled as she tore it open, scanning the dense legal language until 3 words stopped her cold. Debt status. Satisfied. She read it again, then a 3rd time. Her student loans, all $127,000 of them, were paid in full. The letter was dated 3 days ago, signed by attorneys she'd never heard of, referencing a benefactor who wished to remain anonymous. But anonymity was a luxury Kang didn't bother with when he wanted her to know exactly who held the strings. Her phone was already in her hand when the 2nd envelope caught her eye. This one from her landlord. Rent paid through the end of the year, plus a security deposit she'd never managed to scrape together. The 3rd envelope contained a glossy business card for a concierge medical service she couldn't pronounce, with a handwritten note. Your first appointment is scheduled for Thursday at 10 a.m. They specialize in autoimmune disorders. Adiz's apartment suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in with the weight of obligations she hadn't agreed to. She grabbed her jacket and keys, her vision tunneling as rage propelled her out the door and into the November cold. She didn't remember the subway ride to his office building, only the way the receptionist's smile faltered when she stormed past the marble desk without stopping. Miss, you can't just watch me. The elevator ride to the 47th floor took an eternity. Her reflection in the polished doors showed a woman she barely recognized. Hair wild from the wind, cheeks flushed with fury, eyes bright with unshed tears of frustration. When the doors opened, Kang's assistant stood up, but one look at Adiz's face and she simply gestured toward the corner office. He was on a call when she burst in, his back to her as he gazed out at the city skyline. He held up one finger, wait. But she was done waiting. She slammed the envelopes onto his desk hard enough to scatter the papers arranged there. Kang ended his call mid-sentence. I'll call you back. He turned slowly, his expression maddeningly calm. Adiz, I don't need to be saved. Her voice shook, but she held his gaze. You had no right. I had every right. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. You're mine to protect now. That was the agreement. The agreement was marriage, not this. She gestured wildly at the envelopes. Not erasing my life's problems like I'm some charity case. Is that what you think this is? His jaw tightened. Charity? What else would you call it? Investment. The word was sharp, deliberate. In my wife's health. In her ability to focus on us rather than drowning in debts she'll spend the next 20 years repaying. He picked up one of the envelopes, the medical card sliding out. In making sure she doesn't collapse from exhaustion before she admits she needs help. The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. Her body had been whispering warnings for weeks. The persistent fatigue, the joint pain she blamed on double shifts, the brain fog that made simple tasks feel impossible. She'd been so focused on survival that she'd stopped listening. Too late, Kang said, softer now. You already were saved. The only question is whether you're brave enough to accept it. Adiz's pride screamed at her to throw it all back in his face, to prove she didn't need him or his money or his cold, calculating version of care. But her exhausted body, the one that had been running on fumes and spite for months, whispered a different truth. Sometimes surrender wasn't weakness. Sometimes it was the only way to survive long enough to fight another day. The tea had gone cold between them, but neither moved to refresh it. Kang's posture remained unervingly still, like a predator that had already secured its kill and saw no need for further movement. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried the same flat effect one might use to discuss stock prices or traffic patterns. The one who held the knife received special attention, he said, his obsidian eyes fixed on some point beyond the window. Broken fingers first. Ulten. Then his dominant wrist. I wanted him to understand what it meant to never hold a weapon again. He paused, sipping water with the casual grace of a man discussing dinner plans. The others were more straightforward. Fractured ribs. Shattered kneecaps. Nothing fatal, you understand. Just permanent reminders. Adi's breath caught. She should have recoiled. Should have stood up, walked out, reported this confession to someone. Anyone. This was the moment decent people were supposed to recognize evil and run from it. But her hands remained steady on her lap, her pulse oddly calm. The horror she expected to feel never materialized. Instead, something darker bloomed in her chest. Something that tasted like satisfaction. The police found them in an alley 3 blocks from where they attacked you. Kang continued, his tone never wavering from that unsettling neutrality. Screaming, naturally, but coherent enough to provide statements. Fascinating how pain clarifies memory. They confessed to 17 prior assaults. Women they'd brutalized and left broken. He turned to face her then, and there was no remorse in those black depths, only cold satisfaction. Your attack was their last. She knew she should feel sick, should feel the moral weight of what he'd done crushing down on her conscience. Violence begetting violence. An eye for an eye making the whole world blind. All those platitudes her mother had taught her about forgiveness and taking the high road. But sitting here, looking at this man who'd dismantled her attackers with surgical precision, all she felt was a terrible, shameful vindication. They'll never walk properly again, Kang added, almost conversationally. Modern medicine can do remarkable things, but there are limits, especially when someone knows exactly where those limits lie. He set down his glass with deliberate care. I made certain they'd carry their sins in their bones. Adiz found her voice, though it sounded strange to her own ears. You're telling me this because you want me to know what you're capable of. No. For the first time, something flickered across his immaculate features. Not quite emotion, but an acknowledgement of something deeper. I'm telling you because you deserve to know they'll never hurt anyone again. That your terror ended their reign. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. And because I think you understand more than you're willing to admit. He was right, and that realization should have terrified her. But instead, it settled over her like a warm blanket on a cold night. Those men had stolen something from her, her sense of safety, her ability to walk down streets without her heart racing, her trust in the world's basic decency. And Kang had extracted payment in the currency they understood best. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truth. Adiz knew this was the turning point, the moment she either fled from this man and everything he represented, or accepted that darkness recognized darkness. That victims could become complicit in vengeance and still sleep soundly. She met his obsidian eyes and didn't look away. Thank you, she heard herself say, and meant it with a ferocity that surprised her. Whatever lines she'd just crossed, whatever moral boundaries she'd stepped over, they felt less important than the brutal peace his confession had given her. Kang's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. You're welcome, Mrs. Okonkwo. The manila envelope arrived during breakfast, slipped under the penthouse door while the building's security feed mysteriously went dark for exactly 47 seconds. Kang found it when he stepped out to retrieve the morning paper. A habit from his father's generation that he'd never quite abandoned, even in this digital age. He knew what it was before he opened it. The weight was wrong. Too light for documents, too deliberate in its placement. His fingers traced the edge of the envelope as he carried it inside, past the breakfast table where Adiz sat reading on her tablet, sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows and catching in her hair. Work thing, he said when she looked up questioningly. I'll be in my office. He didn't want her to see his hands. They were steady now, but they wouldn't be in a moment. The photograph was 8 by 10, glossy, professional grade. High resolution enough that he could see individual strands of Adiz's hair, the small gold earrings she'd worn that day, the way her coat had caught in the wind as she'd stepped out of the building's main entrance. The timestamp in the corner read 3 days ago, the afternoon she'd gone to the Korean grocery store she liked in Koreatown. but it was the crosshairs that made his blood run cold. Digitally overlaid with surgical precision, centered perfectly over her heart. Red lines intersecting where her pulse would beat. A threat and a promise all in one image. Kong set the photograph down on his desk with deliberate care, the kind of control that came from years of negotiating million-dollar deals while his mind spun calculations of risk and reward. But this wasn't business. This was the line he'd drawn in his own mind, the one thing he'd told himself he wouldn't allow to be touched by the ugliness of his world. He picked up his phone and dialed Marcus Chin. "They're watching her," Kong said without preamble. "Close enough to get clear shots. Professional enough to ghost our security for under a minute." "The Kozlov crew?" Marcus's voice sharpened immediately. "Has to be. This is their signature move, psychological warfare before they strike. They want me rattled. They want me to make a mistake." Kang's fingers tightened on the phone. "They just made this personal." He heard Marcus typing, already mobilizing their people. "I'll triple her security detail. Put counter-surveillance on every route she takes. We can have her protection upgraded within the hour." "She doesn't know she needs protection." Kong turned the photograph face down, unable to look at those crosshairs any longer. "She thinks the most dangerous thing in her life is me being moody about quarterly reports. Then we keep it that way. Shadow detail. She never sees them, never knows they're there." Kong stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city that he'd carved his empire from. Somewhere out there, Viktor Kozlov's people were watching, waiting, thinking they'd found his weak point. They weren't wrong. Adiz had become the one thing he hadn't planned for, the one variable that made all his carefully calculated risks suddenly feel reckless. "No," he said quietly. "We don't hide this from her. She deserves to know what she's dealing with. Boss, if you tell her, she'll leave." "I know." Kong closed his eyes. "But I won't lie to her about the target they've painted on her back. Not about this." He ended the call and stood there for a long moment, listening to the sounds of Adiz moving around in the other room. The clink of her coffee cup. The soft pad of her feet on the marble floor. Normal sounds from a normal morning that had just become anything but. When he finally walked back out, the envelope was locked in his desk safe, but the image of those crosshairs was burned into his mind. They'd made their move. Now it was his turn to respond, and Viktor Kozlov had just taught him exactly how far he was willing to go to keep Adiz safe. Kong drove for 3 hours without speaking, taking roads that didn't appear on any map. Adiz watched the city lights fade behind them until there was only darkness and the occasional flicker of distant farmhouses. When they finally stopped, it was at a structure that looked more like a bunker than a home. Concrete walls emerging from the hillside like something built to survive the end of the world. "Where are we?" she asked as he killed the engine. "Nowhere," he said simply. "That's the point." Inside, the safe house was sparse but functional. Reinforced steel doors. Windows thick enough to stop a bullet. Security monitors covering every angle of approach. Kong moved through the space with practiced efficiency, checking systems, testing locks, his movements betraying a paranoia that had kept him alive this long. Adiz watched him work, this man who had terrorized her city, who wore violence like other men wore cologne. But something was different now. In the harsh fluorescent light, she could see the exhaustion carved into his face, the way his hands trembled slightly when he thought she wasn't looking. "Your grandmother used to make tea," he said suddenly, not turning from the security panel. "Real tea, not the bags. She'd make me sit at her kitchen table for an hour. Wouldn't let me leave until I'd drunk 3 cups and told her what was really wrong." Adiz moved closer. "What year was that?" 2003. I was 15, maybe 16. Running with the wrong crowd because it was better than going home. He finally turned to face her. She found me bleeding in an alley behind her building. Knife wound. Could have called the police, probably should have. Instead, she stitched me up herself and fed me. "That sounds like NNE," Adiz said softly. "For 3 months, I showed up at her door every Thursday. She'd have food ready, always the same lecture about choices and consequences. I thought it was bullshit at the time." Kang's jaw tightened. "Then I got arrested. Spent 2 years inside. When I got out, I went to thank her, to tell her she was right about everything. But your family had moved. I never found her again. Adiz felt something shift in her understanding of this man. Beneath the dragon tattoos and the reputation for cruelty was a scared teenager who'd once sat at her grandmother's table, drinking tea and pretending he didn't need saving. She died 5 years ago, Adiz said. Cancer. Kong nodded slowly, absorbing this. She talked about you. Her granddaughter who was going to be a lawyer, changed the world, all that. Used to show me your school photos. He laughed bitterly. Funny how things turn out. You became what you are because of choices, Adiz said carefully. But you're making a different choice now. Protecting me. Going to war with the Alliance. That means something. It means I'm probably going to die, Kong said flatly. The Alliance doesn't forgive betrayal. But your grandmother gave me something when I was 15 and bleeding and convinced the world had already given up on me. She gave me 3 months of believing I could be something other than what everyone expected. He met Adiz's eyes. I owe her, and the only way I can pay that debt now is to make sure you survive this. Outside, wind rattled the bulletproof windows. Somewhere in the city, the Alliance was mobilizing, planning their next move. But here in this hidden fortress, in the space between who Kong was and who he might have become, Adiz saw the scared teenager her grandmother had saved. She saw the debt that transcended gang loyalty and self-preservation. She saw why, despite everything, he might be the only person she could trust. She would have been proud, Adiz said quietly. That you remembered. Kong turned back to his security monitors, but not before she saw something crack in his carefully maintained armor. Yeah, he said roughly. Maybe. The rain had stopped by the time they returned to the penthouse, leaving the city below glistening like broken glass under the streetlights. Kong stood at the window, his reflection ghosting across the glass, and for the first time in years, he looked uncertain. Adiz watched him from the doorway, still wearing the dress from dinner, her feet bare against the cold marble. She had learned to read his silences, the weight of them, the shape they took in the air between them. You should rest, he said without turning around. Tomorrow will be difficult. She didn't move. You've been saying that for 3 days. His shoulders tensed, the only indication he'd heard her. Outside, the city hummed with late-night traffic, with lives being lived in apartments and bars and back alleys. People who didn't know what it meant to be owned by someone else's decisions. She envied them sometimes, those strangers with their ordinary problems. Kong. His name felt different now, less formal than it had been in her grandmother's house, more intimate than it should be given everything between them. Look at me. He turned slowly, and the expression on his face made her chest tighten. Not the cold mask he wore for the world. Not the calculating predator who'd bought her father's debt like ammunition. This was something rawer, something that looked almost like fear. I've made arrangements, he said, his voice carefully controlled. Your father's remaining debt will be restructured. You'll have options. I don't want options. She crossed the room, her bare feet silent on the floor. I want the truth. The truth is complicated. The truth is always complicated. She stopped in front of him, close enough to see the faint scar along his jaw, the one her grandmother had stitched the night the triad came for him. Close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, to smell the expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask the scent of cigarettes and rain. You've been avoiding me since the restaurant, since you told them I wasn't leaving. His jaw clenched. I shouldn't have said that. Why not? Because it was true. The question hung between them like a challenge, like a confession neither of them was ready to make. In the reflection behind him, she could see herself, smaller than him, younger, less powerful in every measurable way. But there was something in her eyes that matched the intensity in his, something that had been growing since that first night in her grandmother's house. You're not just a debt, he said finally, the words forced out like they'd been locked behind his teeth for too long. You're not just obligation. I can't. He stopped, his hands flexing at his sides. I can't lose you. Not to them. Not to anyone. The admission landed like a physical thing, heavy and undeniable. Adiz reached out slowly, her fingers finding the buttons of his shirt. He didn't stop her as she undid them, one by one, revealing the scar tissue beneath. The map of violence her grandmother had tried to heal, the proof that he'd once been vulnerable to. "Then don't," she whispered, her palm flat against his chest where she could feel his heart beating too fast. The scars were raised beneath her touch, imperfect lines that told stories he'd never shared. "Don't let me go." His hand came up to cover hers, pressing it harder against his chest like he needed her to feel the truth his mouth couldn't speak. In the window's reflection, they looked like two people who'd survived something terrible together, who'd found each other in the wreckage and decided to hold on. "You don't know what you're asking," he said, but his voice had lost its edge. "Yes," she said, "I do." The war ended not with gunfire, but with silence. Kong didn't wait for his enemies to close in. He didn't give them the satisfaction of a final battle or the glory of bringing down Chicago's most elusive kingpin. Instead, he did what no one expected. He dismantled everything himself. Bank accounts were drained. Properties were liquidated. Shell companies dissolved overnight. Every record, every transaction, every name that mattered found its way into the hands of federal allies who owed him favors, or feared him enough to take what he offered. The evidence came with instructions. Use it to gut the syndicate from the inside, but leave certain names untouched. His name, Adi's name. Within 3 weeks, the syndicate fractured. Arrests cascaded through the organization like dominoes. Lieutenants turned on each other. Territory wars erupted as lower-level operators scrambled for scraps. By the time the dust settled, there was nothing left to inherit. Kong watched it all burn from a penthouse window, a glass of whiskey in his hand and Adi's beside him. She said nothing as the city lights flickered below them, as sirens wailed in the distance, as the empire he'd built collapsed into rubble. "You're sure about this?" she asked finally. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I was never sure about anything until you." She didn't smile, didn't cry. She just took his hand and held it, anchoring him to something real, something beyond the blood and the shadows. 6 months later, Adiz stood before a modest brick building on the south side, scissors in hand, a red ribbon stretched across the entrance. The sign above the door read, Neoma Nwosu Free Clinic. Her mother's name, her mother's dream. A small crowd had gathered, neighborhood residents, former patients from her old hospital days, a handful of reporters who'd heard whispers of the story behind the clinic. Adiz's hands trembled slightly as she raised the scissors, but her voice was steady. "My mother believed that healing wasn't a privilege. It was a right," she said. "She spent her life fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. This clinic is her legacy, and it's a promise. No one will be turned away. No one will be forgotten." She cut the ribbon, and the crowd erupted in applause. Kong stood at the back, half hidden in the shadow of a nearby tree. He wore a plain jacket and jeans, his face carefully neutral, his presence deliberate but unobtrusive. No one recognized him. No one suspected that the man who'd funded every brick, every piece of equipment, every salary was standing right there. He preferred it that way. When the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed, Adiz found him waiting by his car. She walked over slowly, exhaustion and pride written across her face. "You didn't have to hide," she said softly. "Yes, I did." He glanced at the clinic, then back at her. "This is yours, not mine. It wouldn't exist without you. It wouldn't matter without you." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're the one who makes it real." She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes for a moment. "What now?" "Now?" He smiled faintly. "Now we live." It was a strange concept, living. Not surviving, not scheming, not looking over their shoulders every second. Just existing in a world they'd carved out together, beyond the violence, beyond the vengeance. They'd both been reborn. Not despite what they'd done, but beyond it. Adiz took his hand, and together they walked toward the clinic. Inside, patients were already arriving. Mothers with sick children, elderly men with nowhere else to turn, immigrants who spoke broken English but understood the word free. Kong watched from the doorway as Adiz moved through the space, Her hands gentle, her voice calm. She belonged here. This was her world now, and he would make sure nothing ever touched it again. Thank you for sticking around with me, my wonderful story family. Before you go, I'd love to ask you for a small favor. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to the channel. It helps me more than you can imagine and keeps these videos coming. The link is right below the video. Drop your location below. I want to know where my story family is watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it. See you in the next one.